Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are going to be looking at a brief introduction to the Bible and also the Bible from the perspective of a historian. And so I have two images on the screen. I have the opening to the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. And in fact, it's the first book of the Torah, the law, which is the most important portion of the Bible for the Jewish people, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And then also an image here of the opening to the New Testament from more than likely a King James version of the Bible, which is English Protestantism's most famous translation. So, kind of starting off here, and of course, we have the images on the screen of the Star of David, Judaism's most well known symbol, and the cross, Christianity's most well known symbol. Let's start off here with that term, the Bible, the word the Bible. Well, in Greek, the word Bible, biblios, refers to a collection of books. We often think of the Bible as a solid book, but it's actually a collection of books, hence its name in Greek, biblios. Just to give an example, at the end of the book of Revelation, the author makes the statement about how, to those that change the words out of this book, God will take away from them, etc., etc. Well, there are plenty of individuals that think that what the author of the book of Revelation was talking about was the Bible as a whole. He wasn't. The Bible, as we would conceive of it, did not actually exist yet. He was referring specifically to his book called Revelation or the Apocalypse. And there was a certain group that he was referencing in that passage. We'll talk about that group later. But continuing forward, the Bible, as we would conceive of it, both the Jewish and the Christian scriptures, has its origins with the canon. The word canon refers to rule or standard of Saint Athanasius of Alexandria in the year 367 CE/AD. Saint Athanasius of Alexandria was the Bishop of Alexandria, which was a prominent bishop at the time, bishopric. The only one that would have been more prominent was the Roman bishopric with its bishop, who we would commonly refer to as the Pope. And essentially, this was Athanasius's Easter letter, where he lists the 27 books of the canonical New Testament from the Gospel of Matthew to the book of Revelation. And that essentially carried on throughout the Christian world. There's still a little bit of debate among Christians about what, is considered part of their Hebrew Bible or what they would call their Old Testament canon. But everybody agrees with the same number of the 27, canonical New Testament books. There are some historians that have tried to make a case for earlier than this. I remember one time browsing around and I came across a page. I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember it was a website that, had reference to Reformed in it. So certainly it would have been something from a Calvinist-based institution. But the authors tried to argue that Origen of Alexandria, who was a presbyter slash priest in Alexandria, that he actually had a canon, much earlier than Athanasius. Um, the problem with Origen and his canon is that he lists certain books, but he's not specific about which ones they are. Like, for example, he mentions these letters of Paul, but he doesn't say specifically what letters. Whereas Athanasius, just mentions them all outright. And so that's where, you would have Athanasius of Alexandria in 367 CE and his canon from his Easter letter essentially, carried on throughout the Christian world. We have no autographs or first editions of any of the books of the Bible, only copies. So, of all of the books of the Bible, we don't have the autographs or first editions. We only have copies. And copyists change things, sometimes by accident. They wrote something down wrong, but other times with intent. Uh, You know, uh, this is horribly written, and I can do a much better job of it. And you can see this when we go from our earliest manuscripts of the Bible that we have available to later manuscripts. You will see changes. Like, for example, our earliest manuscript of the Gospel of Mark ends with an empty tomb. But then a copyist essentially stated, you know what, this is a horrible ending, and I can make it better. And that's where you have what we call the longer ending of Mark, where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears before his disciples and talks about how you'll be able to pick up serpents and no one will be able to harm you, nothing can harm you, etc. Well, that particular portion is not part of our earliest manuscript that we have of the Gospel of Mark. Now, I will mention that what we call the later, edition of Mark, it doesn't change its canonical or divine status. And what I mean by that is if a particular group or community holds something to be canonical or divinely inspired, it doesn't matter when it was written or who wrote it for that matter. It doesn't matter if it was written today or if it was written 1,000 years ago. If it's considered divinely inspired, it's divinely inspired. In the case of the books of the Bible, we are not for certain who many of the authors of those books truly were. Well, we know, of course, who traditionally is considered to be the author of a particular work, but when you look at the rhetoric, you start to begin to ask questions. Just to give some examples, um, there are 14 letters in the canonical New Testament that are historically attributed to the Apostle Paul. Historians question him being the author of half of those works. And one of those works, the letter to the Hebrews, has pretty much been completely removed as a Pauline letter. Or think, for example, the Gospel of Matthew, said to have been written by Jesus' disciple Matthew, Matthew the tax collector, Levi the tax collector. Have you ever wondered, though, why it's written from a third person perspective? Even Matthew's own call to conversion is written from a third person perspective. Now, arguably, probably some of what's in Matthew does go back to the man that it's associated with, but in terms of its end result, we don't know who wrote it. It's essentially anonymous here. Now, again, if a particular, group or community finds something to be canonical or divinely inspired, it doesn't really matter who wrote it or when it was written. In this case, the author is really a minor issue. And for the Jewish people, the most important portion of their scriptures, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh refers to Torah, and there are no vowels in Hebrew, so vowels end up getting put in when the Hebrew uh, language gets transferred into our Latin/Roman alphabet. But T for Torah, and then N for Nevi'im, the prophetic/historical books, and then K for Ketuvim, the writings. But essentially what Christians refer to as the Old Testament, but the most important portion of their scriptures is the Torah, the law or the Pentateuch, the first five books, but essentially Genesis through Deuteronomy. So for the Jewish people, the most important portion of the Hebrew Bible is the Torah, the law, the first five books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The other portions of the Bible, like the historic slash prophetic books, like the King books, or the writings like the book of Job, or the Psalms, or the book of Proverbs, yeah, they're important, but they don't carry the same amount of weight as the Torah or the law does. Just to give kind of an example with that, I don't see this apparel much anymore, but I do remember at one time Christians used to wear apparel with the initials WWJD and a question mark, essentially standing for what would Jesus do? Well, the Jewish people who do not have a belief in Jesus, and I might as well add something with that too, because occasionally I see Christians try to find ways to bring Jesus into the Jewish faith. Like they'll try to argue that, the Jewish people see Jesus as a prophet. No, they don't. Um, in my Religions of the World class, there is often a true or false question that I ask, and it's something along the lines of how the Jewish people reject the notion of Jesus as the Messiah, but they do see him as a prophet, and the answer to the question is false. But when students have answered that incorrectly, or sometimes they'll say, well, Jesus was a historical figure and he was Jewish, to which I respond back, yes, Jesus was a historical figure and he was Jewish, but so was Sigmund Freud. And the Jewish people don't have any beliefs about him. But anyway, so for the Jewish people, again, the Torah, the law, is the most important portion of their scriptures. The other portion of their scriptures, the prophetic slash historical books like the King books, or the writings like the book of Job or the Psalms or the book of Proverbs, yeah, they're important, but they don't carry the same amount of weight as the Torah, the law does. And, again, going back to a point that I referenced, you had Christians with apparel with the initials WWJD, what would Jesus do? And of course, the Jewish people that don't share a belief in Jesus and obviously reject the Christian scriptures, which are what's known as the New Testament. But to counter, that apparel to something more closer to their own, they created apparel with the statement asking the question with the letters, the acronym WDTS, which stands for What Does Torah Say? So, anyway, well, I think that we'll stop here, but when we continue on, we will look more at a brief introduction to the Bible and should probably get into looking at the Bible from the perspective of a historian. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.